All right. So, were you all able to make a copy of that course document? Great. All right. So, is Ramin joining us?
No.
No. Okay.
I left his name on the document though, because he created the first draft of it when
there we
did
go.
something last January. So, and about 30% of the document, maybe 40% was from that.
Lovely. Awesome. All right. So, as I think everyone joining us on this call knows, and I suppose anyone who's watching this at some point in the future, we're going to be losing our personal access to Blackboard at the end of the semester in just about a month, actually.
Actually, a bit less than that.
A bit less than that.
Wasn't it?
Well, I think at faculty assembly, they said it was
December 8th.
I think December 9th is what they said.
Okay, so about a month.
But about a month, right?
Right before finals, because, of course, we don't need that time. That was a local decision, by the way. We could have had it for another week or two.
So, we wanted to make sure that everyone had the tools, available to them to download and archive their own classes for their personal use, so that if we're, have we taught a class, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and we're planning on reteaching that class, we're going to have to import it into Brightspace. And of course, we can get that assistance beyond when we lose access to Blackboard, but it is helpful to just have our own personal archives of that, so that we don't necessarily have to go through a request process to get those data available to us at a later
if everyone
point.
went through the request process, it would be a huge backlog. So,
Yeah.
Giving ourselves some autonomy is probably helpful.
Yeah.
Plus, the backups that are created, at least the ones that we use to build our new courses, will not generally contain grade data. Now, again, apparently the archives that they'll be saving for at least a couple of years will have that, and you could get a request for that. But it's not uncommon to get a request for a letter of reference from a student you had 2 or 3 years ago, or sometimes even 5 or 6 or 7 years ago if the student is coming back and returning. So it's really nice at the very least to have your gradebook data, which is one of the things we wanted to talk about, because we're not sure how much of that will be backed up. The last few years probably will be, and it could be retrieved, but it's a whole lot easier having it right in your own directory than to have to request it and hope that that version is available when you want it.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to go to the right window to do that. And we'll go ahead and check here. Okay. And can everyone see? I've got 2 windows open. The step-by-step archiving courses, which I think everyone can see, and also the Blackboard login page. So just let me know if you can't see that for any reason. All right, so here are, I'm just going to pick, I suppose, a random course to start with. I'll do it one of my summer courses. And so I'm going to go ahead and select my death penalty class as an option. Okay. And I'm going to scroll, once I enter into that class, I'm going to scroll down on that left-hand menu that we're all fairly familiar with. I'm going to open up the packages and utilities menu. Okay, and on that menu, you'll see export and archive course. Okay. So go ahead and click on that link, and you can export package, right? That's the language on that button here.
But one of the problems was, didn't you switch to Brightspace this summer?
Oh, I did. You're right. So there's probably
there really
nothing
isn't
there.
much in here.
Yeah,
So
that's a good point.
Let's try a different course, maybe from the spring.
Good point. Okay, so okay, we'll jump into
spring or fall.
Yeah, we'll do spring senior seminar. Okay, so. So follow that same menu.
And you guys can follow along and try it if you like.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely encourage to do that. All right. So we'll go to packages and utilities. We're going to export an archive course. We're going to go ahead and select export package. Okay. And, you know, here, you know, we find it easiest to copy all of the materials available, right? So links and copies of the files in the course default directory.
And I would also select the other option in the second one to get everything.
Yeah, so that way we're not missing anything. Right. So I suppose you would use calculate size at some point, but it, you know, at this point, it shouldn't be too much of a concern. So then you'll scroll down to the select course materials. It's just easiest to select all. Unless, of course, there's, you know, some things that you don't necessarily want to carry over. But for the sake of archiving a course, it makes sense to take as much as you can from the course and then, you know, later on decide what you want to import into Brightspace.
And while this will contain student data for the discussions and things, those would not be actually ported into Brightspace. So,
right.
You know, you may want to, on the discussion boards, for example, include only the forums with no starter post, because otherwise it will save your student discussions, but you won't have a way of reading them anyway. So
yeah. So we'll go ahead and we'll follow that. And then you'll go ahead and hit submit. And it takes a little while for the action to be complete. So typically you'll get an email when that process is complete.
and we could probably come back to that. Well,
I just refreshed the
Okay.
page. So once I refreshed the page, it's, you know, became available. So
okay.
here it is, export file. And this is nice because it shows, you know, that this is from the spring 2022 course. This is my CRJ 401 class. So I can go ahead and I can download this, I think, just by clicking on the link there. Okay. And so there it is. And, you know, if I wanted to bring this over to my Google Drive, I could drag and drop it over there. I could go into Google Drive and upload it into Google Drive if I like.
And you may want to organize it by semester, by year, by academic years, whatever, and copy anything that you might ever want to use again.
Yeah. And so, you know, it's that just following those options are going to get us all of that course material. And so you would just continue to repeat this process for every course that you wanted to archive for yourself. Are there any questions on that? So far, no questions so far. So actually, I've never exported the gradebook specifically, so we're going to go ahead and do that.
I just wrote up the instructions a few minutes ago.
Yeah, so I'm going to follow them, and that will be our test of how well.
This is something I was doing anyway in my
Yeah.
classes, just because I wanted to have records of students' grades in case they deleted the Blackboard copies.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so on that left-hand menu, we can select our grade center. I will note that this will probably bring up some student grades. And so
before we release a recording, we will hide them all.
Yeah, so just to
Ignore them. Cover
yeah,
your eyes.
everyone just be, you know, clear that this is for educational purposes and not for
Full grade center.
Yeah. So we're going to click full grade center. Okay. And actually it looks like, you know, as it pops up, it's not going to show anything yet. So that's
Okay.
good. And
So
we're gonna,
actually, this works.
yeah, so this is good. So we're gonna follow the work offline menu option here. And as we hover over it, we're gonna click download. Okay. Oh, good. So I'm very pleased this didn't
Do the
add
full
more
grade
work,
center?
right? So we're gonna click full grade center. That's gonna show us everything. Of course, you could select just different columns, but again, for the purpose of keeping all of the data, we want to keep that full grade center highlighted. So then we're gonna just go ahead and
The defaults generally work. You could do either comma or tab limited. Shouldn't matter.
and you could select the location of where you want to save it to.
Well, only leave it on my computer. Do not use a content collection because that's part of Blackboard.
Oh,
and
that's
that
fair.
will go away along with Blackboard.
There. So but if you wanted to, locate a folder on your computer, you could, download that specifically. Otherwise, it'll be in your downloads folder. So go ahead and hit submit. And again, that might take a minute for us to, oh, maybe not. So we'll go ahead and select download. And there we are. So when you're organizing the archives of your courses, it would be good, as John was saying, to organize this by semester, but also you can make sure that you're putting the grade book with every section of the class that you're downloading, in that same folder. Any questions about that? Good so far?
No questions so far.
Good. All right. And definitely chime in if you do have any questions about that. So I guess I've not done the course evaluation survey results. I guess I've done that through this menu, but we'll do.
So you can do it in two ways. If it displays in the gradebook as it is in your case, you could just click on view results. Otherwise, you can go down to the course, what is it?
Course tools.
And then test surveys and polls. And select surveys. And then it would be in there if you had surveys. So this could also be used to download surveys that you had done if you want the data. But for the Blackboard surveys of course evaluations, if your department did it through this,
right,
this would be useful, especially if you're putting together a portfolio for promotion, retention, and tenure. This will all be going away if you don't download it. So you may want to just click on view results.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and select this assessment questionnaire. So, my department, we have an assessment questionnaire. We also have a course evaluation for the senior seminar course. That's why there's two different ones that are popping up there. This, unfortunately, I only had 6 submissions received in this, but I still want to keep it because I need to put this in my tenure file coming up here soon. So we're going to go ahead and select the response period here. I don't really need a comparison. I've never really selected that option. I'm not sure in what instance you would.
I'm even sure if it'll work.
If it would
That
work.
would be
So
if you want to get aggregate data across your courses.
oh, interesting. The next option is to just simply click view results. And that's going to show, that's going to bring me to the survey itself. So it's taking a second to process. And then from there, I can print the report or send it to a PDF.
Right, and because if you have Adobe installed Acrobat, Reader or whatever, you have the option of printing to a PDF, which is probably the best way to store things because then you have a digital copy of it. But if you want, you can send it to a printer as well.
Right, and so we have that print report option, printable view. I always pick the printable view with comments because I want to keep the open-ended comments section with my results here. And so from there, you can click the download option. If it's not coming up with a download option, again, like John said, you can print to PDF and select that. So I'll go ahead and click my download option. you know, this,
You may
this,
want to
yeah, you might want to give it
a
a, yeah, a name that makes a little more sense for you. And this was my student, I think it was the assessment survey. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And again, I can drag and drop, or I could have identified where I wanted that particular document to save.
But
So,
right now, they're all in your download folder, and if you have Google Drive open, you could select all of them and just copy them into a folder for that course and repeat that for all of your courses for at least several years.
yeah. So here's my downloads folder, and I've got all three of those documents I just downloaded today. And so I can drag and drop into a folder for my Google Drive. So that kind of sums up how we get the data from Blackboard. Do we want to load it?
Well, it's a question. Do you want to see how to load your courses
into Brightspace, or is that?
Is this a course you're going to offer in the spring?
Not this spring, but it's a class I'm teaching currently. Maybe in the following fall. I'm going to be on leave in the spring. So
That's right.
yeah.
Yeah. So,
So probably at some point.
well, but you do have a course shell.
I do have a course shell. Yep. So I can,
So you could
yeah,
load
I
it
can
in.
absolutely, yeah. And I've got a, so I'll go ahead and I'll log into.
And you don't have to do this. This is only if you want to build
Yeah.
your course for the next time you're offering.
Yeah. So I have, you know, and I think most everybody does have, you know, an empty course shell that they might want to, you know, bring over. And you can always request empty course shells too. Sorry, where am I gonna go? Where am I gonna put this?
You could
We'll
do
put
the
it,
conversion.
yeah, we'll put it in here, this conversions semester. So I selected, this was an independent study that I did. And there's no content in here at the moment. At least maybe there's a little bit of content that I've played around with, but this wasn't actually live for any student enrolled in this. I just corresponded with them over email for this particular.
You can probably make this full screen, too.
Yeah, we'll do that. So if we want to go ahead and import, you know, let's say that senior seminar course, we would select this. So once you select the course that you want to bring that information in from, you want to select the gear, like over to the right of your name at the very top. And you're going to select that import, export, and copy components. Okay. All right. And so you're going to select import components. And we're going to start from there. So you would do copy components if you were picking another course in Brightspace.
Something you've already
Built in Brightspace that you want to copy into another section. So if you're teaching a class this semester and you want to copy that material over to the same class but different section that you're teaching in the following semester, that's the option you would pick there. And of course, you can always export your courses that you've already built. But in this case, we're building a course from our Blackboard course shell. So we're going to import those components. So we're going to click Start. Okay. In here, we want to just upload our course file. So if you remember, that's our zip file here. So I'm just going to drag and drop it. I just find that to be the easiest. Okay. All right, and once it's ready to be uploaded, I'm just going to import all of the components. I find that again to be a bit easier to import everything and then kind of decide if I need to rearrange or remove something after the fact. That way I'm not having to import some components and then realize I'm missing components and need to go back and do it over again. So this is probably going to be the way that is most efficient, less frustrating for people. But you could, of course, if you so chose, imported certain components and left others. So I like that it gives you this reminder. This would be a great time to take a short break. Like, okay, take a little short break.
So any questions?
No, not at the moment.
They will come when we start doing this.
Yeah, I think, that's certainly the case. And we're always here if you do have questions, especially if you're going through, and I think especially in the import process, if you're going through and you're unsure, we're always here to answer anything.
And the instructional designers will provide assistance if you'd like them to help you migrate your courses.
Yeah. Yeah, we wanted to make sure that, approaching that December deadline where we're going to lose access to our personal Blackboards, that we'll be able to kind of download whatever it is we need, and we can, use that information, as needed.
So it's uploaded all the content, it's converted it into the form, and now it's imported it. So now you can view the content, and there's your course.
Yeah. And so, it may be the case that, this is just the way I formatted my course in Blackboard, but all of my content is coming in under the content module over here. So, for me, I can take all of these and make them into their own modules, and as opposed to sub modules, which I think is how they're organized right now. And
But-
it's an easy drag and drop process. And
But we've gone through the whole
Yes.
process, and this is all you need to do.
Yeah.
And
there's everything, so from week 1, we've got everything I've, created for that class, and anything I would need to edit, I can do that in here. Any other questions, or, and again, you can take this time to, start working on your own. It's a pretty, John did a good job, documenting all of those steps in this document here. So we've shared that with everybody.
well, Remain had done the initial version, but when we
Yes.
did a workshop on trying out the sandbox last January.
Yeah.
How you're going to share this document?
It's, if you click on the link in the chat, let me put it back there, because you may have come in after.
Okay,
you get
okay.
that. If you click on that, it will save it automatically to you. Well, it'll ask you and then save it to Google Drive.
Okay, beautiful.
Yeah.
It's there. Thank you.
Good. Well, if there's no questions, I think that's really the basic structure of how to take content from Blackboard, move it into Brightspace, and start creating all of those personal archives of the classes that we've taught. It is something that you do class by class in Blackboard. And so if you've been here for a very long time and you've been teaching a lot of different courses, it could take a while to get through, the downloading of all of these. It's a rather simple process,
So
but
do this in one window while you're doing
Yeah.
something else.
yeah, it's a good
be
thing to
watching a
watch
movie,
TV
yeah.
and, just going through and making, sure you have all of that, but, you could be doing this for 30 or 40 sections of a course that you've taught over, or I suppose maybe that's my experience, having taught for about 6 years here or 5 years here. So it might be the case that this, takes a couple of hours to get through, every single class that you're interested in archiving. So make sure you allocate some time, but it's relatively, once you get the hang of it, it's easy. You could watch TV or watch a movie while you're doing this.
And it's especially important if there's some course that you had developed several years ago that you think you may need in the
Mhm.
future, but it's not regularly offered, because the archives that they're getting is for the limited period of time, and I don't know how many years they were archiving. I seem to remember a discussion of possibly 2 years of
Yeah.
archives.
That's what I
So-
recalled too. So,
So if there's a course you offered 5 years ago that you're planning to offer again in a year or two, make a backup copy of it.
yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave you now and try to work a little bit. Thank you, John, for making this available. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I just have one question.
Sure.
Yeah.
Not directly on this. How do when you imported to Brightspace, your content were all in one folder. How do you when you expanded it, how do you make each of them independent? Is there any shortcut?
What I do is I just drag it. I use the, actually,
I
if
can-
you
I can
stop recording and
yeah.
I'll show you. Because that's a separate topic, but what you can do, actually, maybe you could do it with yours.
I probably can.
Yeah, if you share it, we can take a look, because the structure of a Brightspace course is generally linear. So each module should be just from file to file. It's the same philosophy that Canvas uses.
Just
So,
stop
yeah,
that recording.
stop the